G'day, you're listening to the Big Breakdown podcast with Kris, Stafford and Harrison Marshall. Take it away, fellas.
Hello and welcome along to season 4 of the Big Breakdown podcast, where this season we are looking at talent development and today we are looking at psychosocial behaviours. Harrison, it's been a few weeks since we've had an episode out, but here we are with episode 3 of season 4 and we've got a great guest ahead of us.
Well, you can't rush something that's high quality, can you? Because quality takes its time.
Correct, it does, and we also was struggling to get a guest, and Andy was miraculously agreed to come on at the very last minute, and he and come and chat to us, and I'm really looking forward to having a chat with him about it. But I think psychosocial behaviour stuff, I think it's a real interesting piece that probably isn't covered enough of how important it is within not just the talent development pathway, but grassroots coaching in general.
What we've spoken around a lot in a lot of previous episodes is understanding our who. Now, if you're going to understand it, there's always going to be areas in which we can help develop their who. So why isn't it more spoken around in the world of coaching? Well, we've got a cracking guest on today that hopefully can give us some insight into how we can begin to incorporate it into our own coaching.
We do. So today we are joined by Dr. Andrew Abraham, Head of Subject of Sports Coaching at Leeds Beckett University. Andrew joined Leeds Beckett University in November 2007. During this time, he's acted as Group Leader for Sports Coaching. He's been involved in the development of numerous undergraduate and postgraduate degrees in the area of sports coaching as well. One of the most pleasing aspects of his work is seeing graduates from the course gain professional roles, making positive impacts in developing of young people and other coaches. Andrew's most recently been involved in developing and delivering a postgraduate diploma in coach development to coach developer within the English Football Association. As well as being an academic on the sports coaching at Leeds Beckett University, Andy has also got experience of coaching rugby union within grassroots game, coaching his son's age group from under sevens upwards. Andy joins us today to chat about psychosocial development within the talent development pathway. Andy, how are you?
I'm all right, thank you. All good, thanks. Yeah.
Good. Thank you. Thanks for agreeing to come on. In this season of the podcast, we're looking at sort of talent development and just some general advice that coaches can have for sort of supporting play development at clubs, basically. And then sort of in this episode, we really want to focus on psychosocial behavioural skills. I think it'd be good if we could just kick off by just giving us an overview of when we say that, what is it we mean by that?
Yeah, it's. I think it's a very broad and all-encompassing term, which you could pretty much put anything under there. Which essentially they're the skills that allow us to engage in life at its most simplistic level. In terms of when kids first go to school, how do they make friends? How do they deal with a teacher? How do they actually just thrive in life generally? And then you can perhaps move more into a greater level of specialism in terms of looking at, well, are there any of these things which start to really help in certain circumstances? So we for example, the classic one is going into exams. That's a fairly unique experience, and for some that might being environment, and we probably should offer people the skills in which they can cope with the way in which they feel about the environment. I suppose I like analogies, and a sort of analogy is, everyone learns to walk pretty much. People with the capability learn to walk. But we know that when you put people under pressure, the walking patterns change. So everyone can learn to walk to, engage in life. But if someone suddenly says, by the way, you're going to walk, for a roofer, for example, going up on a roof, maybe 30 or 40 feet up, then probably they need to learn to walk in a more specialized way to cope with the demands that they're now in. And I think psychosocial, psycho-behavioural skills in that, and that everyone will develop them to some extent just to get through life, but there's times when we might need them to be a little bit more specialised and developed to cope with the demands that life is starting to throw at us. So that's a nice way to get into it, perhaps.
No, it's
go on, Harrison. I was just writing
no,
that down then.
no, it's very interesting. I think, like you say there, for us, from us in the coaching context, there, it's, you know, with it being so all encompassing, it's it can be quite difficult for us to begin to break down how much. I know it's probably quite a generic question here, but you know, people see sport. How is sport kind of used as a main vehicle driver for developing these skills?
Well, I mean, sport is a setting, isn't it? We want, even if you engage in individual sports, it's still a social setting. To that social setting, we have to have a set of skills that allow us to do that. And you can go from a very people, you know, we probably all remember the shy kid who didn't get involved. Now, there's actually research that looks at shyness and around chronic shyness and what's lacking in terms of someone's capability of actually engaging with the group. And actually, good coaches will try and encourage that person to have confidence in the skills that they have in order to enter that group. So, you know, you can look at something as simple as saying hello to a group of people, of a phrase which is used, which is play entry. You've got a child which says, "Can I play?" That's a really skill that people have. People don't have that. We perhaps need to help them develop that, and that's what parents do. Go and see if you can play, or I'll come with you, and you know we'll try and get you involved with it. And just by nature of engaging in that social setting, we'll start to develop a set of skills that allows to do that. So then starting to understand the rule, being what it's like to be in that setting, is what's acceptable and what's acceptable. And you see over a period of time, the social skills, people's capacity and respect and trust each other, and essentially understand the rules of that setting, and that what happens when the rules get broken. And do people have the control over their behaviour, or do they get upset? And if they get upset, what happens then? So you start to see these things build over a period of time with children into later childhood, into adolescence, and into adulthood. And they will just develop simply by us being part of a social setting that allows us to develop those. I think once you get into sports, suddenly there's this idea of perhaps winning and losing, and what happens when we win or lose, and what do we reinforce when we win and lose. So children are very good at knowing. Like we know, I've been coaching my rugby team now since the under-6s. I wouldn't keep score of any game, not least because actually I knew that probably for a lot of the years we lost quite a lot of our games, but I wanted to downplay that sense and not play the fact, well, we just played a game. Plus, they knew whether or not they'd won or lost. They didn't need me to tell them that. But if we overemphasize that, then generally speaking, throughout it, within about 5 minutes of the game finishing, they've either gone home or we've gone in to get the hot dog or whatever. They're now chatting, and the results gets forgotten quite quickly. So just by the social setting, they start to understand the idea of, well, in fact, they might not understand. It might just be an implicit development of, I've played a game of rugby, I've gone and had a chat with my mates, and I've gone home again. So it becomes, you become able to regulate the idea of coping with winning or losing, and recognizing, within a few minutes of it finishing, there's something else that comes along, and it's now time to chat with my mates. Sorry, I'm hoping this is following some sort of coherent line, but I think there's a thing which sport does. So it enables us to develop emotional skills. It enables us to develop our capacity to participate in a group and interact with that group and communicate with that group. And perhaps as part of that, we then, I think a key one from a psychosocial point of view, and we can talk about the difference between psychosocial and psychobehavioural. There's really a difference, but starting to understand the moral rules that we as a country would like to follow, or we as a society would like to follow. That idea of sportspersonship and accepting defeat graciously and winning graciously, and kids don't always do that. We know that. Adults don't always do that. We really know that. So I think it just offers lots of different opportunities. I think the key thing is eventually with this is what happens when those skills aren't being developed. So generally speaking, those skills will develop just simply by allowing people to engage in that social setting. And there's lots of social settings. There's school, there's being at home with your parents, there's being with your family, being with your friends. There's lots of opportunity to develop some of these skills, but sometimes they're not developed. And that's the bit I think where we might want to start looking at being a bit more of taking more of an intervention approach in terms of explicitly trying to develop some of these things.
I think that I remember when I used to do some coach education for the RFU on the old was it the England Rugby Coaching Award? They used to do a task for the coaches to do in the room where they get them to describe sort of what the coach's experience were of what their best player was, or what their the difficult player was, and compare the characteristics. And very few, surprisingly for the coaches, were technical and tactical issues. Everything that they put down were the ones, so that the ones that were the key characteristics that they liked were around their commitment, the work rate, they were on time, they were respectful, alongside the ones that were the difficult player was the one that was not coachable, which is a rabbit hole that would go down in itself, and other things like that. But it was quite interesting that some coaches were actually quite taken aback that actually, on the surface of things, the technical and tactical side with coaching kids wasn't actually something that they responded to as coaches the most. It was more actually what was the players like in front of us.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose these things are really important. Like you say, they are real life skills that we're developing. How as coaches, if we're more aware of it, what can we be doing to develop these within our sessions?
Well, I mean, let's say, you've got the classic. We've got these things around like things called like the 5 C's, which Kris Harwood from Rugby University put together quite a number of years ago now. And then you've got the other 5 C's, which was put together by Jean Gauthier and Wade Gilbert, although actually I think that was building on Lerner's original work around positive youth development. So we've got things like competence, character, connection, confidence and caring, which is the work from Lerner, I think, and then the work from Kris Harwood around commitment, communication, concentration, control and confidence. Now, having it nicely labelled as 5 C's, although there are actually 2 different sets of 5 C's, which is probably not always the most helpful thing, but they're done with the idea of, if you step back and go, why would people try to package something? And ultimately, the idea of that is to facilitate people in going, I know social skills exist, but I don't really know what they are, and I can't really pin them down, which then makes it quite difficult to create a curriculum. And that's just the same for people who go into coaching for the first time. I've played this sport for years and years, and you guys know this, having done the Masters with us, but how well do people really know the sport? I played it for years and years, but how well do I really know it? And if I don't know it very well, it then becomes difficult to create a curriculum, a coherent curriculum that I can follow over a period of time. So I think what the 5 C's, the 2 sets of 5 C's have done is it's almost tried to develop at the initial, the start of a curriculum. Now, I have my own view around those, which is I'm not sure that it offers sufficient definition, but I'm sure those authors would say, well, if you go and read, there's plenty of definition in if you want to go and have a look at it. So, what is it that coaches need to do? Coaches need to do everything, don't they? That's the part of the problem of being a coach is, there's nothing you don't need to know. It's about perhaps starting to understand what that curriculum is. And I think a lot of it begins with going back to some of those more fundamental social skills of how well do kids take feedback? Do kids even ask for feedback? my poor old son Fred, who he knows he gets used as a bit of a talking tool, but I constantly say to him, Fred, what's the most useful feedback? And he'll eventually he now knows the answer. He'll rolls his eyes and goes, okay, it's the feedback I asked for. But often we don't encourage kids to ask for feedback. We just give it to them. And then we wonder why it perhaps, goes in one ear and out the other. Well, it's because they've not asked for that feedback. Our assumption is that we should just give it to them. So, and there is a study which has shown that, and it's just, there's probably other studies, but there is a study which has shown that the most useful feedback in that study was the feedback which was asked for. But what if kids don't feel confident at asking for feedback? Especially once you hit that adolescence phase where it moves from being, so we know from a social setting point of view is that once kids move into adolescence, peers become more important, on superficially at least, than adults, and that might be coaches so asking for feedback in front of your mates takes some guts, because you can just be you're the teacher's pet idea and all those sorts of things that we all, probably all four of us, all three of us, I'm seeing people now, but all three of us, because I can see three faces and I realise I'm one of them now. We all go through that period of, and you guys were involved when we talked about the role of impression management, is how we start to manage the impression we're presenting in front of the people we think are important. And if those people we think are important are peers, and those peers don't think that asking questions is a sign of coolness or whatever, it's definitely not cool to say coolness, then then they start to withdraw a little bit. So that's the psychosocial skill of simply asking for feedback, and it's not simple, suddenly starts to be removed. So that ability to take ownership over who I am within this social setting is a really core skill. And you see it all the time where people don't do it, and they don't develop some level of self-control in terms of what happens when we start to win and lose, as in, so for example, there's the idea of attribution theory. How do we attribute things that happen to us? So if I'm losing, what we tend to see a lot of is kids starting to shout at each other and give fairly generic but meaningless, either encouraging or discouraging comments. We've got to do better. And I still do this, by the way, in five-a-side, so it's not just kids, adults do it all the time, rather than having the capacity to identify what's really going on here in order to facilitate a change to make things better. So you start to deal with frustration, you start to, you're able to park the frustration and start to focus on what we need to do differently. So they're all classic sort of psychosocial skills. And you could argue, so Collins and McNamara would probably start to say that ability becomes more of a psycho-behavioural skill, because it's definitely a focused idea on how I affect my behaviour in the moment. So yeah, hopefully that's, sometimes I forget the question and I keep talking, so I'll stop there for a minute.
No, I think you touched on some really good points there. I think actually sometimes it comes back to some of the behaviours that we might exhibit as coaches as well. We're at the end of the day, we're also human beings, and we get frustrated, and we might see things on the pitch that want to make us pull our own hair out. But that's where it's really important that we're aware of our that we keep asking the players to be more self-aware, and that's key element for them as a player. But that's where for us as coaches, we need to have that self-awareness as well. And actually, I think sometimes, I know that I've been guilty of it. We're not quite self-aware of the body language and our tone and the way that we sometimes present ourselves. And I think working myself with college students, 16 to 18, they pick up on they pick up on everything. As much as they are looking to impress their peers, but they do pick up on what the coaches are doing, how the coaches are behaving, and that can very much really quickly influence their behaviours as well. So with that, how would you encourage coaches to begin to regulate not only how they present themselves, but also how they're seeing players present themselves to each other, enable the players to not feel that pressure from their peers to want to progress or want to search for feedback?
Yeah, I mean, what a big question. That's the first thing. It's
Before we get the big guess.
yeah, so obviously, again, you guys know about the who, what, how, and we can look at. So, as a coach, I need to the three, I'd say core. I mean, there's more than three, because I'd say understanding yourself is core, based on what you just said there, Harrison. But you can, if you go with the who, what, how, who is it you're coaching, what are you coaching them, and how you're trying to do that. Well, psychosocial and psychobehavioural realistically fits in all three of them, because we know that the better we can understand the person stood in front of us from a biopsychosocial point of view, the more we can perhaps target our intervention. So we can use our understanding of psychosocial and psychobehavioural skills in order to understand the person who stood in front of us. But we can also use psychobehavioural and psychosocial skills as being a curriculum of what I'm actually trying to teach you. So it's an explicit part of the curriculum that we're trying to get over here. But we can then also use it as part of the idea of how I choose to communicate, which is a core how skill. So, so for example, simply saying to people, I want you to keep going. I will only stop when you've got a question you want to ask. That might be you never stop. So, but it would be an interesting thing to choose to do that if we know things like that. And again, it's not completely, it's not an absolutism, it's a truism. Is that the best feedback is the feedback which is requested. But we only know that that's going to be helpful if the person we're asking to do that has actually got the confidence to go, can you just come and tell me about something over here? Because if they haven't, they're never going to ask for that feedback. So it fits within the who, what, and the how in terms of how we choose to engage in a coaching process. So I think for me, where does it start? It starts with, as with all these things, it starts with understanding. How well do you understand the curriculum that you want to deliver, and how well do you understand the person you're trying to deliver it to? And how do you get that understanding? You have to engage in some form of professional development. And that might be NGB, it might be university, it might be the fact there's a lot of free resource available through things like I Coach Kids. Simsborough have got a fair amount of things available these days. There's a lot of free stuff available out there. I think part of the problem is well, yeah, that's a very good point. Podcasts. I'm going to come back to that in a second, actually. I remember that. Podcasts are an amazing resource, but so yeah, you have to go and find something. Now, the reason why I'll come back to that is, and we've just written a little bit about this. I'm writing a book chapter which is led by Anna Stodter. And we've talked about only briefly about the role of podcasts. And there was a phrase which someone came up years ago, I can't remember who it was now, but it was a brilliant phrase, which is word salad. As in, it's a nice salad of words, but does it actually fill you up? And I think this is potentially the problem with podcasts, is that they're interesting to listen to, but there's so much that goes on within them. How do you capture it into something which is meaningful? Now, I think podcasts are brilliant for generating curiosity and engagement. What I think they're less good for is really pinning down, go and look at these things. So I would say, for example, we've written a book chapter on planning. There's a section in there on, and it's available on ResearchGate, but preferably go and buy the book that it's in. I should remember the name of the book, but it's edited by Christine Nash. It's just been reissued. But the chapter we put in there try to identify what are the actual psychosocial skills we think people need, and what are the actual psychobehavioural skills that people need. Now, there's a resource there which captures them, which I'm not going to talk through. I'm not going to read it out word for me. I've got it literally in front of me at the moment just to sort of make things tweak in my head. But then, by the way, that's a psychobehavioural skill. It's called preparation. So I think it's about going to the reading. So, the Harwood and the Sports Coach UK, or sorry, UK Coaching have got these 5 C's in infographics. They all exist somewhere if you want to go and look at them. But it's about trying to capture it into a meaningful concept that you can then put into your work. So how do we do it? I think the point is to understand, you've got to go away and do some research, do some reading, talk to people, listen to podcasts.
I think you're right, Andy. I think that's one of the things that we've really tried to do with the episodes that we've put out, is actually try and get stuff that coaches can take away from it and actually apply. Yeah. So actually on that then, because you like you said, you've coached your sons at rugby group since they were 6. What sort of stuff have you put in place at sort of Zebras to sort of develop on these skills as well as the rugby side of things?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a really good question, Chris, because that's it's a phrase I use is if you're going to be an educator, make sure hypocrisy is in your curriculum, because have I done it particularly well myself? Ish. But not. I'm not going to say I've done it brilliantly, because ultimately you've only got so much time. So it's one of the things I would say to any coach who works in that sort of voluntary capacity is just add up the number of hours you've got with the kids over a year, and it's unlikely to come to much more unless you're in something a bit more, in inverted commas, serious. But for the first 4 years, I was with the Otley rugby team. We just met on a Sunday for 2 hours. So over a year, that's probably not much more. By the time you've taken out the time when it's absolutely chucked it down or the pitches are frozen, maybe between 25 and 30 weeks. So you're not much more than 50 to 60 hours. So there's relatively little you can do. So what I would say in that situation is, if you're aware of the things that you'd like people to do, probably your biggest tool within that is going to be modeling the things that you want, rather than it being an explicit part of the curriculum. You would model it in terms of your own behaviors and the tasks that you set. So and again, this I'll talk about, and you guys know this as well already, but again, it's in that planning chapter, is if you think about planning a session about what's your objectives, what's the tasks, how are you going to engage, how are you going to communicate, and what sort of engagement do you want from the players? So there were times that I deliberately set up practices which were confusing. So I was expecting the players to be confused. Now that's, it takes a while to get to that point, but I was interested to see how they might respond to that confusion, and whether or not they would ask any questions, or would they stick with it? So you can start to build some of these things in a relatively implicit way into the tasks that you design, and the way in which you communicate or don't communicate. And you can be deliberately disruptive. And I think being deliberately disruptive is a good way of doing things. But to come back to your question, Chris, that's probably been being more led by beliefs and concepts rather than an explicitly written down curriculum that I'm going to plan for over a number of weeks or years. If, however, we look at this from, so if we look at the degree that we run with a group of young people, so they are still, we know that adolescence now probably carries on till about 25, 26. So if you look at degree students coming in at 18, they are still at the, some would argue they're in the middle of adolescence, not at the end of it. If you think adolescence kicking off about 13 and finishing about 26 in terms of the brain maturation, they're only probably about halfway, not less than halfway through adolescence by that point. So when you look at it from that perspective, we know that there's still a lot of time that we need to spend with those people developing their skills. So we are relatively explicit in the way in which we run a degree in how we're trying to build those skills. So if you're asking me as someone who's designed a long-term program of learning for young people, yes, it is explicitly built into that program. If you're asking me as the coach, volunteer coach, then it's more of it's explicit to an extent, but it's explicit based on my beliefs and concepts rather than an explicit curriculum that follows people through time. So it's more about the modeling process with some things put in, and perhaps some conversations with people who going back to what I was saying before, is we can use the idea of psychosocial, psycho-behavioural to understand our players. So yeah, I do look at the players and think about the way in which I interact with them based on what I think they might need more of. Again, it's, perhaps at some point that becomes more explicit. We're at the under 16s level now, and there are some of these lads who are really starting to push on and want to progress into a talent program. And I think we can talk about what does it mean to be in a talent program, because I think then there is a need to really get more explicit with people. So I think our degree is a talent program. So people have been through 15 years of education, and as they've gone through, they've been given more and more choice over what they do. But they then hit a degree, and I'm going, well, we're now, if you looked at it from a football point of view, they're in the professional development phase, the phase where they're trying to develop and ready themselves for the next step. It's the last stage of their formal, unless we go on and do a master's degree or whatever, but for realistically, it's the last stage of their formal educational programs as a young person before they move on. So I see us as being that final stage of talent development, and I do see it as being our job to really push hard. And there's implications for that when we have things like the National Student Survey, for example, which don't necessarily reflect the fact that we should be pushing students hard. So, I think we should be disrupting students. That if you read any literature around adult education, it talks about the crucial role of being disruptive. Now, if you want, there's a conflict then between, if we're too disruptive, do we just make them a bit annoyed? And by the time then they sit down to fill a questionnaire which says, how nice was your course? The two are in conflict. But I still believe, I think it's more important for us to be disruptive than it is to facilitate someone filling in a questionnaire for us. So yeah, I think I think there's a difference between being that voluntary coach and being that coach within a talent program. Is the pair of you are really, so Harrison, you're part of that ACE Academy program, I presume still, and Kris, why does the university have a rugby program that invests a lot in it? It's because it's, I think the RFU see the university program as being a side entry tool for, not like a ruck side entry, but, crap joke there, but it's,
we appreciate it, Andy.
But it's still a talent pro. It's a different route in for perhaps the people who haven't gone straight into playing championship or premiership rugby. There's a if you like a third strand that they've now created to offer a greater opportunity for more players to then progress in, while still the opportunity to engage in an educational program. So I think there's a difference between that voluntary and professional sector in terms of what you can do or what you should do.
Yeah, and I think I see that firsthand. With at 16 they enter kind of the pathway in which they get seen by me, that being an ACE Academy or an academy setup. And this is where we probably do need to be a little bit more explicit with kind of what key attributes from a psycho-behavioural standpoint that we're after, just because the demands at the next step, which is, well, in my setting is for, well, potentially 3 of them, we're averaging 4 players each year going on and signing professional contracts. Now that's a step up. That's a step up again within the pathway, and like you were saying, they're still in that adolescent phase. But I think what we do in our 2 years is almost try and give them the necessary tools to be able to cope with the increased demands on their side of their psychological skills to deal with that kind of elite step up. Mm-hmm. So at the age of 16, what kind of, I know it's not a one size fits all shoe, but in terms of generic skills from a psychological standpoint, would you say that they kind of, I mean, I've got an idea in my head here, but in your examples, when they finish your under 16s at the end of this season, when they go on to whatever they go on to, what key social skills would you like to see them exhibit?
The first one fundamentally is understanding. Now we might go, is that psycho-behavioural psychological skill? I think it's a fundamental skill, which whatever you go into is what's the level of understanding. So do people, when they are put into a talent program, however we want to talk about that. So like I say, I think going into a degree course is a talent program. You know, it's a final stage. I think it's a really helpful analogy for us to start looking at it like that. So do they understand what it means to be in a talent program? Do they understand the expectations which come with that? So whilst we might be talking about that, the best feedback is the feedback which is requested, we might hope that people do that. I think you stop hoping, you start expecting. You know, people should be asking for it, going, and it might be, so, you know, I'm trying to do this, what do you think? I really want to get to this level, what do you think I need to do? And your answer to that question might well be, well, I think you need to go and work that out for yourself a little bit, come back to me and we'll start talking a bit more detail. But if you just want me to give you the answer, we're not doing that anymore. So I think understanding the expectation of what it means to be in a talent program. Now, people will be at different stages of their capacity to understand that. So then you're getting into things like, well, if you don't quite understand that, we might need to start somewhere else in terms of the skills you need, versus if you do understand that, then we've got something else to go on to. But when we see these coexisting talent programs, so you're both in those. So the ACE has got the what's they call dual career, this idea of a dual career thing of educate. You're in education, you're in both full-time education and full-time talent, which is in itself an interesting idea, which is, can you be full-time in both? But if you were to read the work of Anya McNamara and Dave Collins, they would talk very, very strongly about the power of the transferability of these skills. So if you're not turning up on time for lectures, then there's a problem. If you're not telling people that you're not going to lectures, there's a problem. If you're in a talent program, if you use these skills properly within your educational program, you should all be hitting pretty high level grades, because someone said to you, you can do this. So your grades should probably reflect that. If your grades are crap, then there might be some issue that we need to get into, but it might also be because these skills that you need to be in this rugby program or in this ice skating program or this basketball program, they should be transferring across. And if they're not, you perhaps need to be asking yourself why they're not. I think that should be a core expectation of people seeing the transferability of these things. So how do we do that? Well, I'm just going to go back to say, well, you go and look at the reading and look at how people do. So I'll just very briefly run through what Anya and Dave talk about. So they talk about, what is it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 core psycho-behavioural skills. So commitment to the performance domain, vision of what it takes to develop, goal setting, focus and distraction control, belief can excel, as in belief you can excel, quality practice, coping with pressure, realistic performance evaluations, social and communication skills, imagery. So they're saying that, if you like, there's both your curriculum, but also your tools that you can, perhaps look at people with. But something as simple as quality practice, how many people actually understand what it means to engage in a quality practice? And I don't think that's just players. I think that's anyone who goes into a setting which is meant to be about being better, but do they really understand what it means to be better? So, and I think coaches can facilitate that. So again, hypocrisy coming to the fore here, because I don't do this anywhere near enough. How often do coaches start the session off with saying, right, today, guys, what we're going to do is of these 3 or 4 things, rather than saying, okay, guys, who can tell me what we're going to do today? Because actually the program has already been set out for the players to look at prior to coming. And the question becomes, who can tell me what we're meant to be doing today? And has anyone got anything specific that they'd like to actually target whilst we're doing that today? So, we as lecturers have to put out module handbooks. But how often, and again, I tried to make sure I do this, but how often when you were at university, did any of your lecturers refer explicitly back to the handbook on each session you turned up for? Or how many just started lecturing?
Oh.
Yeah, okay. Your silence speaks volumes. So, I think...
Since we both did it, we need to be given the benefit of the doubt. I can't remember what I did last week, let alone 2 years ago.
Yeah, that's fair enough. But, we write out learning outcomes for students to look at. Now, you could argue, how can you write a learning outcome before you know who the learner is? But I think everyone's got to have a sense of where we see ourselves going. But something, so when you start to break these things down, quality practice, now I wouldn't say any more than you would try and teach, pick every single rugby skill going and try and teach it in one session. You can't take all 10 of those and try and teach it in one session. So I think it becomes about, as a coach, identifying where you think you would want to start. My general view is, for a lot of people, would be understanding what quality practice is, and focus, distraction control, and some performance evaluations might be the 3 places where I see there being some of the biggest issues around. But I would also do some psychosocial skills in there as well, in terms of that capacity to communicate with people, tell people what you're actually thinking. But I think that comes again back to a coach's or a leader's capacity to model those behaviors, as in, your willingness. It's a phrase I use a lot with the students, is be prepared to look stupid. The more you are, the less you will. So that willingness to stand up in front of people and say something which potentially puts you at risk of being judged is a really core skill, I think. And that if you're not willing to do that, now it may be that there'll be some people who never want to do that, but will be quite happy to come and speak to you one-to-one. You go, well, okay, on balance, I'll cope with that. That's fine. We'll stick with that. I don't want people to be show ponies just for the sake of being a show pony. And if you watch, there are some people who are very happy to ask questions or answer questions, but only when they know the answers. So there's a difference between engaging in something and showing off. There are some people who quite like to show off, but will only show off when they know how to show off. And if they don't, they'll stay quiet. So, so to come back to your question, Harrison, I think, at 16, I think that you're starting to hit that stage where people should be more willing to be aware of what they're in. Now again, we know from there's some research done in personality development. So if you look at the 5 core traits of openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, if you look at some of the research around that, we know that conscientiousness tends to go with people's willingness to engage for example, in an educational program in a way which seems to be like they're self-aware of what they're doing. What we also know is that in adolescent boys, conscientiousness as a whole, if you looked at it as a group, tends to drop and then come back up again towards the end of adolescence. So just at a time when we might want boys to be, and I'll talk about boys, and it doesn't happen to the same extent with girls. So just as we perhaps want boys to be starting to recognize what it's like to be in a talent program, part of their personality shifts, and it's not like it's a drop like off a cliff edge. It's a drop and then it comes back up again. That's when we tend to want them to be starting to recognize what it's like. So you might have to sometimes accept that this is not going to go as well as you'd really like it to go for some of those boys. And that's similar for girls as well, but when you look at the research, and whether or not this is a socialization effect or whether or not it's a brain maturation effect is open to question, but you probably won't see the same thing if you're coaching girls in a talent program. But generally speaking, the socialization process people go through will still leave them with, I'd like you to be more like this versus I'd like you to be more like this. So I've spoken to people who coached, I've coached young females and young males, and you can generally see a greater willingness not to, excuse my French, dick about when you coach young females, when you coach young males. Now, is that a sex difference, or is that a gender difference? As in, if it's a sex difference, it's almost like it's built in, it's hardwired in that will be the case. Whereas it is a gender difference, is that just because girls are treated differently from boys through an educational program in terms of both parenting and teaching? I think that's opened the question, but it doesn't mean you can't use these skills to just try and make sense of going, ideally, again, if you to look at the data around males and females who are in inverted commas elite, typically there's not really any great difference in terms of the skills that these people have. So once you get past that adolescent point and you look at elites, it seems to be that if you want to be really good at something, you probably have all of these pretty well nailed down, or a good chunk of them pretty well nailed down. So it's not like it's something which carries on through, if you like. It just seems to be there might be those differences earlier on.
Andy, with sort of looking back at the talent development side of things, and we'll take DPP as an example for this. You've mentioned a few times about the best feedback is the feedback we request. Obviously, when you've gone through that process of getting in or not getting in, and feedback is then provided, is there obviously that's usually quite generic feedback. What could within the pathways, as an example, what could they do better in these examples to make sure that feedback is encouraging the players to then come and ask for feedback alongside that? I don't really know. There's a question in there somewhere, but I'm not quite sure where I'm going with it.
Yeah, I think that again, it comes back to resource, I think, with those things, Chris, as in, I mean, obviously, I've seen elements of the Yorkshire DPP programme, and there's a resource which says, who's staffing that? And if you're relatively reliant on volunteer coaches to do that, then there's only so much you can expect from a system that operates like that. Now, there's all sorts of good reasons why it operates like that. So there's no implied criticism in that at all. It is what it is. And people go into these things with best intentions and in good faith. And, we should fundamentally respect that people do that on that basis. But if you look at the way schools operate, schools typically have, so the school that my son goes to, they have a planner. Now, ideally, that planner is something that they fill in because they see it's a good thing to do, rather than if you don't do this, you get told off. So if you've got, so what is your plan for the being in the DPP program? Well, what is the plan of the DPP program? It's almost like a circular argument. If they don't know what the plan is, how can they have a plan for it? And I think that comes back to the question around quality practices. What are they going to get the opportunity to do, and when do they find that out? And if they're only finding out when they arrive, then it's hard to respond to that. So you then have to sort of respond to it. So, when I've watched it, I think there's, a talent program from a technical, tactical point of view. What happens is you just play probably with a group of players who are probably a bit more motivated and a bit more skilled. So the level just goes up anyway. It's irrespective of what a coach does, the level will go up because what's expected will change because of that. And you could argue that's actually not a bad thing at all, really. But if you're looking at it more from a talent program, so you'll be aware of the work of Pam Richards, where she talks about slow off field, fast on field. What do players see a talent program being? Is it simply about turning up and going in a coaching session, which is on the pitch, in the pool, on the court, on the range, whatever? Or is a coaching program about a slow off field, fast on field? And how are they expected to engage with performance analysis feedback? Do they do anything with that, or are they just told about that? And how does that align with their own individual plan for what it is they think they want to be getting better at? And I think most players sort of know what they want to get better at, but are they explicitly asked to try and identify those things? Because if I don't really know what I'm meant to be getting better at, how can I then ask for feedback on what I want to get better at? So you can look at it as this idea of, if I go back to Colin's things here, and Bonnier and Dave's things, a commitment to performance domain and vision of what it takes to develop. If I don't know what it takes to develop, it's hard for me to have that vision. And if I don't have the vision, how can I ask for feedback on something? Now, I might have a bit of vision about going, so if I'm in rugby, I want my kicking to be better. I want my jackling to be better. So I might have pictures of things that I think I need to be better at. So I do have some level of vision. But do I have a vision of overall what that might need to be? Again, coming back from that, there's 16. We've got to have some realistic expectations of what that is. So it might take 2 or 3 years to actually build the capacity to have the vision in the first place. And what does it really mean to be an elite rugby player? And I think some of that might also be about, do you know how hard this will be and what the level of competition will be? And everything that entails in terms of your capacity to engage in quality practice day after day. And, it's not always going to be the TV. And, you're suddenly, someone's running highlight reels of you running in 3 or 4 tries. What it's not showing is the sore shoulder, the injuries, the minor injuries you're having to carry, the how hard you've had to work in training, all those different things. Do they have that vision of what it really means to be that player? But you can't just suddenly go, boof, have all of that to a 16-year-old, because it'll blow their minds. So it comes back to, and that's why I say, if you look at the planning, how do we want to plan this over a period of time? And how do we help that player understand and buy into that plan, and are they able to contribute to that plan? Then I think if we can do that, then we're probably moving in a decent direction. But that's a lot to ask of. It's too much to ask of a volunteer. It's not if you're working with someone who's potentially got a full-time opportunity.
I also think it goes back to that conversation you had around being a disruptor. Now, for us as coaches, we can develop some of these understandings and skills by putting challenges in there and being that disruptor. I think there's actually a new paper by Jamie Taylor on how we can put more challenges within in this development pathway. Is that something that, do you think, before the age? I know that we look at it in our environment. I know that the academy look at it as well, in terms of, right, we will deliberately put challenges in, almost to set the players up to fail and look at how they begin to overcome and come together to try and exhibit some of those key psychological skills. Mm-hmm. Is that something that you should be considering if you're coaching under 16s and below, or do you think you should allow them to try and learn to develop these skills before trying to really test them at those older age groups?
You do it when it's ready. I think that, to me, that's the core element of this. It's not an age specific thing. I think it's, if you've got someone, if you go back to, for example, again, you guys will be aware of the 3 worlds idea of why do you come to rugby? Is it because you just like playing rugby and be with your mates? Is it because you actually want to be better than you are currently? You actually have a goal to be better? Or is it that you're coming because you want to be the best in this group and you want to really push yourself on? You've probably got those players like that. It depends. If you've got some early maturers, as in early cognitive maturers, you might have a player like that from the age of 12. Yeah, I mean, so if you've got that player at the age of 12, why wouldn't you help them make use of that? Now, it might be that their motivation changes and then they go, actually, no, I just want to turn up and play because school's kicking in, homework's kicking in, I'm finding all these different things quite difficult. But then you could be going, well, just think about how you take that skill and do it over there. even when you don't like things. So actually doing things that you don't like doing is actually a pretty good skill to have. Because by the way, that's what it's going to be like if you want to be a professional rugby player. There'll be things that you have to do that you don't really enjoy doing, but you have to do if you want to be this. So, if you don't want to do that homework, well, what are you going to do about that? You're just going to sit and sulk about it, or are you actually going to accept the challenge and just crack on? So those are things you can do. Now, I think you can do that from the age of 12. And I think, it's not a bad thing for parents to see when you see your child really enjoying something and buying into it, and actually see them when the challenge comes along, they actually keep investing in it, that you go, well, what were you doing there that you could perhaps do over here with the things you don't enjoy? Now, as you're hitting teenagers, they may look at you as if to go, and you might guess that I perhaps had this, is the eye roll and the, oh, shut up. But actually, we know that despite the fact that adolescents start to be more engaging with their peers, I can't remember where, this is a piece of research I read a while ago. It might well be from someone like Sarah Jane Blakemore, who's well worth following on Twitter and well worth getting her book, is that it's the core thing for a parent at that stage is to be the steadying influence that doesn't disappear. So despite the fact that adolescents might treat their parents like shit sometimes, not all times, is the core element of that is that they feel able to do that because they know that they can do that, and that person's not going to disappear on them. So it's almost like the parent stays as the anchor in that scenario, or the carer. So irrespective of the shit that person might put you through, that person stays steady. Now, it doesn't mean you don't fall out and all those different things that parents and kids do, as we'll have experienced as kids where we fall out with parents, but it's that steadying influence. So even though parents might say that sort of stuff and think, oh, it's in one ear, out the other, probably some of it will stick now and then. So I think, again, what can coaches do as part of talent programs is get the parents to buy into this. Get them to see the links across the fact that if you've got these skills in this environment, there's no reason why you can't take that skill and put it into this environment. So if you keep going when things are tough here, you should be able to recognize that and use it in a different environment where you're giving up when things are getting tough. And that cross-fertilization you then start to build a level of self-awareness of what it means to be talented, and so they get more ownership. And I come back to that word again, they start to understand, what does it mean to be talented, in inverted commas. And I think that's a conversation that we should probably be having with anyone who goes into a DPP program or whatever talent pathway exists. That should be a fairly important conversation early on, as in, what does it mean to be here, and what are the expectations that are now on you? And by the way, if this isn't what you want to do because you just want to play rugby, as in, how many times do people who are good at rugby or good at sport, who are selected into a talent program without ever being asked, do you want to be in a talent program, without ever being told this is what it means to be a talent program, and that person goes, I just like playing football, I just like playing rugby. You're suddenly telling me I need to be all these things, and you're shouting at me because I'm not that person, but actually that's not the person I want to be. So we make assumptions. We might watch what players are doing and think, well, you're a talented player, you need to be in a talent program, without ever saying to them, do you want to be in a talent program? Then you could see how you could put that person off quite quickly. And there's been people, when we've introduced that three worlds idea, I remember you probably know, well, you might, I don't know where she was in the levels, but Chrissy Patterson, very good football coach, took the women's football team at Leeds Beckett for a few years. She's now back up in the northeast, and she's involved in one of the centres up there. She recognised that one of her best players was, she played football because she just liked playing football. She wasn't particularly interested in being that talented player that everyone assumed she wanted to be. She was just a good footballer. So again, sorry, I'm waffling a little bit there, but hopefully it makes sense. But I think it comes back to being, why, if I understand your motivations and I understand the things I think you need to be better at, but what do I understand about your reasons for being here? And And have I explained those? Do I get into the expectancies of what's coming here, and can I get you to see the crossover effects of some of these things?
I think that's a sort of a great thing to sort of finish on there, Andy. I think there's been lots there that I think people will be able to take away. I mean, I've got like 2 pages worth of notes again, which is brilliant. And you know, that's the whole point, is we want to try and make sure that we can make coaches more aware of some of these things. And you've just made some great points there to finish around, you know, understanding the reasons why, their motivation, why they're part of it, and then trying to add that and include that into the practice that we're creating and the quality of that. And I think there'll be lots of stuff that coaches can connect and take away there. So thanks for giving up your time on your day off and coming to chat to us.
Yeah, no problem. I'm still waiting to see what I'm doing on my day off yet, so I'm all right. Might be coffee time now. In fact, the dog's looking at me saying, when we're going out. But yeah, thanks very much for having me on, though, guys. I mean, hopefully helpful. But I'll just reinforce the idea that podcasts, I think they're really great for generating curiosity. But so my signpost would be that there's a book chapter online which is about planning. It's on ResearchGate. People want to go and look at it. Then, you know, it gets into the beginnings of this, and then there's all sorts of directions you can go off and work with that. So yeah, hopefully it's a good stimulus to move on to look at other things.
Excellent. No, thank you. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Well, I think that was worth a 3-week delay on putting out an episode, Harrison, because Andy's blown my mind there with some of the stuff that we spoke about in the last hour.
Yes, yeah, I did. I think both of us had. I definitely had 2 years of Andrew Abraham leading a lot of my stuff on my masters, and I didn't think he could blow my mind anymore. But the man never ceases to amaze. I think there was a real fascinating insight into psychosocial and psycho-behavioural skills and how they look in the development pathway. But I think they also gave us some cracking insight how we can actually begin to deliver that in multiple different environments that we're in.
Yeah, and I think he really focused on that psychology bit, and a lot of Andy's other research has sort of been linked sort of around that, especially within sort of coach decision making and other things as well. But you know, I think one of the things that we probably do forget, especially when we're coaching with these age groups, is around this assumption that we should always be the person that gives feedback. You know, we talk about in coach education that, you know, you've got to be seen to be actively coaching, which then involves part of that is giving feedback. When actually, I've got it written down here that Andy's written down that at a certain point that their peers become more important. So actually the feedback that we're giving is sometimes probably meaningless compared to how it might come from one another, rather than me as a 35-year-old bloke coaching a bunch of 15-year-olds.
Yeah, and I think throughout all of that chat around feedback and what Andy was saying there, kind of really reminded me of a conversation we had back in, was it season 3 with Mark. Oh, I know, but we've done so much in between with Mark Bennett around, you know, how we can begin to incorporate what I think he called ninjas, especially the more confident players in the group, and you know, and maybe can we encourage them to give, you know, feedback to other players? Can we encourage them to actually essentially speak up and actually ask for feedback themselves? Because, you know, like I said, the best form of feedback is the feedback that they ask for, because that means they're actively listening, they're wanting to engage in the process, and you know, they want to get better. So that's why they're coming to us. Well, you as a 34-year-old man, to enable them to want to get better. So, you know, let's use the resources we have around us. Now, if that's someone who's a little bit more confident within the group, bam, let's use it. Let's use him as a ninja. And that's what really kind of, you know, it sparked a lot of good memories back from that Mark Bennett episode. Yeah,
because I mean, Andy touched on the fact that we've got to make they've got to be prepared sometimes to look stupid, which, you know, is not always the case when you're with your peers. But actually, I've got it on here that, you know, people's willingness to engage and is linked to their self-awareness. So actually, they generally only answer the questions that they feel they know the answers to because it's comfortable. I think, you know, you touched on it with him around that chat around Jamie Taylor's recent paper on like challenge and how we bring that in. And you know, I think it's right. We probably do need to challenge more, but actually, it's doing it in the right way, and that comes back to something that we've talked about a lot in all 3 seasons of the podcast around that understanding the who and how understanding your participants is still number one. of everything that we do.
Yeah, and that's what was majorly interesting. Is that Andy gave examples of how the psychosocial and psycho-behavioural stuff really kind of fits into understanding our who, understanding our what, and understanding our how. How are we introducing it into our curriculum? What does that look like? And if we understand the who, that's how we can link the three together. I think what was evident throughout all of that these psychological skills that we learn from any sport, not just rugby, it could be tennis, football, basketball, netball. Those psychological skills are transferable in all walks of life. They are ultimately social skills. They are that competitive edge that you need to survive in the world. It's that knowing how to lose correctly. That's pivotal when things go wrong in life. You need to be able to break that down. And that's why it got really interesting with that chat with, when you were talking around McNamara and Collins around transferable skills, especially in psychology. Now, your best rugby players, he was saying, should be the best in the classroom because they know how to apply themselves. They apply themselves in the best way in every environment. And that's something that I know that we've been really strong at in my environment, is that we want to develop you as a person, an athlete, and as a player. So when the going gets tough, when it's really tough and it's you're 70 minutes into a game with 10 minutes left on the clock, you're not just going to give up because it's got a little bit hard, and that transfers over. But you've got an assignment due in a week's time. You might potentially have left it to the last minute, but you've got that mental fortitude to stick with it and really get the best grades out of yourself.
Yeah, no, and he referenced that back on the course and how they like to see that transferable skill linked to that as well.
That was what was so. But that kind of blew my mind when we were talking around adolescence and how that actually goes from, he was, in his eyes, that goes from 13 all the way to 26. Now that explains a lot. I've worked in the university environment with you. You're working in it now, and you've probably got 21, 22-year-olds in there that actually still aren't adults yet in terms of brain maturation. And actually, it's really important, even at a university standpoint, that we're still drilling in these good behaviours and actually beginning to develop their understanding of the environments that they're in and what that might impact going forward, but also impact them in the current environment that they're in.
No, I agree, because he touched on it at the very start of the conversation, that sport is a social setting, and that actually all of these things come out of it. But it was interesting when we recorded that on literally Monday morning to come out on the Wednesday that we're going out, and I've had a full day at work then, and met a few players, and actually started to bring in some of with some of the one-to-ones I had. We never actually got on to chatting about the rugby. We really focused on them and how they're doing first and foremost. And I don't know if that had a positive correlation, but actually we trained really well on Monday night. So I don't know whether they felt more relaxed because we'd actually talk about the actual tech and tack side of things. We were more seeing where they're at as people and connect with them more on that level, rather than actually delving into the weeds of some tech and tack stuff. And I even started with the first question. Obviously, we've previewed for the game that we're going to do on Wednesday. So I started with the first question was, tell me what we're doing today in attack. Well, the first question I asked lads, see how many we're going to interact with it and get that engagement straight away. And it did have a positive. Well, it was a good session. That could have just been a fluke, but actually the engagement from the players rather than coming from me was all player led anyway. And it was just quite interesting to start with that question rather than sort of outlining what the objectives were, which is what I would probably do normally.
Yeah, but that once again, it puts yourself as a coach in the firing line under the spotlight. That you have to make sure that your messaging is really clear before they go out there, so that there's a clear understanding. And this is what and this is one of the big takeaways I think for anyone that's listening now, is that we're quite fortunate because we're full-time coaches and this is our environment. But when we're looking to develop these skills from really kind of under 8s and upwards, we do that through modelling. And this is what Andy spoke around a lot around, modelling those positive behaviours. And yes, at the start of that, it's up until about 13, 14 when he spoke about it, the role models are still the coaches. It's still us. If we're modelling those strong behaviours and we're enforcing those strong behaviours, when they do step up and start looking at their peers to impress, hopefully their peers are also beginning to model those positive behaviours. And it's really important that, and this goes back to the previous season, when we talk about coaching behaviours in Neil Holmes. Now, everything is a coaching behaviour. I'm not putting more pressure on coaches, but if you're there 15 minutes early and you're putting out the cones and you're doing that every week and you miss a week, all of a sudden you're breaking that habit. The players understanding of you and your behaviour, they know that it's off, and then all of a sudden they potentially could think that there's a chink in the armour. So this is really important that if we want these young players to grow up and be respectful, competitive, knowing how to win, knowing how to lose in good ways, then we need to make sure that we're modelling these positive behaviours from a young age, and that includes potentially just shouting on the sideline, or maybe shouldn't be shouting on the sideline. Oh, that could open a can of worms, couldn't it, Kris?
Yeah. Even then, it does it. That's. You see a lot of these young coaches, and that is generally how a lot of them tend to come out of the blocks and coach. And I was the same until I became more self-aware. And that was what sort of I've got it written down here. What Andy talked about, the role of impression management. Who am I? And that really links back to the episode with Dan Abrams, where we did the whole thing around understanding you and personal characteristics and the role that they play. So if you've been interested by anything in this episode with Andy, you definitely need to go and listen to the episode with Dan, because again, we spoke to Dan for well over an hour on that, and I had a massive headache after that because there was just so much detail in there, and that completely, again, we've used this phrase a lot, but just blew my mind. And it's definitely something we need to be more aware of, because everyone will develop these skills, but sometimes we just need to be specific with them as well and be really clear on how we're developing these social skills to make these players more social. Yeah,
100%, 100%. But then, to be honest, Kris, I think knowing you for the last 7 years, not many little things can blow your mind. So these conversations.
How long has it been? 7 years. Fucking hell.
Time flies, eh? So yeah. Wow. But yeah, I've learned. But no, it was a cracking episode, and there's I think there's plenty to take away from that.
There is. So there's only going to be a week until we'll be back next week. We'll be looking at more things on the talent development stuff with technical and tactical, which we'll be looking at next week, and the role that plays within talent development. Charlie's got all our social media details at the end, and we'll see you next time.
Cheers for listening. Don't forget to join in the discussion at Big Breakdown HQ on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.